Yes, a little bit about Nikhil. So Nikhil is an assistant professor here at the Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities, for those of you who don't know him. So he has a PhD in South Asian Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. And his area of study has especially been modern Indian political thought, and more specifically the modern Hindi novel. And he's been writing on this quite regularly in various forums. His book, which is really his PhD dissertation, came out in 2014, and it's called Between Love and Freedom, the figure of the revolutionary in the modern Hindi novel. And from working closely with Nikhil, I know that even though he writes a lot about the modern political thought and modernism in regional languages, that he has a deep feeling and fascination for ancient Indian history and literature, and so much of this event is really, Sundar's encouragement and also just Nikhil's insistence and passion for that time period. And so, everyone has been so sweetly and graciously thanking me, but I'm more like the admin staff and helping out with the logistics. So much of this event is about him, and I'll let him present now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Is it on? Thank you all. Is it on? It is okay. You can't tell from here. And also thank Professor Thapar again for coming, and to repeat what I think I've said more than once already, to engage with all of us who are really not specialists in this field. So I think you've been extraordinarily gracious and generous, because for the most part, at least I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I'll try, and maybe there is one strand or one out of 100 things that might actually be useful. So I'd like to speak a little bit about the book, because I did want to a little bit contextualize the format a little bit. I didn't want the discussion to be overly abstract and to the point where people were asking questions where they had no idea what the books were about. So that's why I did request most of the speakers, and which they've all graciously done, to actually tell you something about the book, or whichever book they've picked, so that you have some real context, right? Okay, so I will also talk a little bit about the book. So it's Professor Devika already showed you the book. I have the photocopy here. So it's 700 pages, and that's rare, and today. It's astonishingly detailed. It carries the weight of this very massive erudition, but it carries the weight very, very lightly. And I think it's really a lifetime scholarship, but it's honed to the point that you can, I think if you really, have depth, then you can carry it lightly and not wear it on your sleeve, as maybe too many of us do all the time. So I can't do justice, again, as has been said many times before, to a lot of the details, because actually in some ways the flesh or the marrow of the book is in some ways the detail, as it should be. And the arguments are very involved, very long, very intricate, and I'm probably going to make a lot of, I hope, small mistakes talking about it. But I think for me, part of the fascination that Gayatri talked about is just, I think if you're working in the modern period, you're very proud of saying, oh, that kind of statement couldn't have been said in the 20s, it could only have been said in the 30s, because you develop this very strong sense of what is possible to be said at a particular point. So then when we come to a world where, you're 1500 BC to, 1200, 1500 AD, and where, in some ways Sanskrit is particularly maybe resistant to being able to, temporalize or historicize, and, those of us who've done work with Pollock has made much of this sort of atemporality of it, which I think should be maybe brought down to earth a little more. But still, it is just astonishing to be able to deal with that time scale. And I think a large part of the fascination is that you already feel like you're in this world of gods. So I think I'm grateful actually for that, for just the opportunity to actually stay in this world, to prepare this talk. But we've had a whole semester reading the older text, which I dutifully inflict on my students every year, and they nor me have a very good idea why we're doing it. But I think that the more inchoate claim is simply that there is something to be said for a different world, to say it in a strong sense, a different world, right? Otherwise we're too familiar and, modernity, and sometimes it's just boring, and I think one has to actually get a feeling for a very, very different world, a very intelligent world, but which could articulate these questions differently, and without the overwhelming weight or conscience, which maybe this differs a little bit from Professor Thapar, of us very conscious of sitting here looking back. So different kinds of arguments about what it takes to look at that past. So sometimes, as an ethical claim, maybe one has to talk about locatedness in the present. Sometimes one wants to really bracket that off, and because one feels that one can actually uncover more systematic and wholesome and marvelous difference by actually forgetting. And so I have no problems with historians who say, I want to, I'm going to pretend I'm in a time machine, and but that's a different ethics and a different project. So that's part of the diversity of the field. Okay. Since Professor Devika also alluded to it, I'd also want to talk about, and maybe because you're literature teachers, the style of the book, which I think is really a model, again, as has been said, for very unfussy writing, which for my book is very high praise, because I think it's very hard for people to, again, I think it's part of the whole thing of wearing your, wanting to show what you know. So it's very clear, it's deeply internalized what it's trying to say. It's not pretentious at all, which is lots of marks for that. And I think it's just really, it's very efficient, it moves swiftly, so it's, you don't see the work of what it takes to synthesize that amount of material and then just move on. And then keep raising questions and then move on, saying, okay, this is where the state of the field is here, and I've asked this question, and right now nobody can answer this too quickly, and I can't do my next book, so I will just move on. So I think that kind of, there's a lot to be said for that kind of pacing of the writing and the speed and the but it's also light. That a 700-page book being light is, I think, but an important thing to say, because you could read a 200-page book and it could bore you out of your mind or whatever, or just weigh you down. But I think what emerges out of this with a lot of, one really feels one has learned a lot. And I think one just forgets that that's a large part of the value of reading, that one really learns and one is immersed in this very, very large world. And there are so many, 1,000 different kinds of questions that could be asked. So, so thank you for all that. And so my talk will really be structured as discussion points. So I will actually talk about the architecture of the book a little bit, just to orient you, and Professor Devika has already done it, so we'd split the book and she did the first half and I did the sort of second half. But I think the overall architecture also to sort of, ground the discussion. So I'm not, of course, going to repeat what she said. I'll just repeat the titles, because this is another instance of good writing, I think, where your title actually does what it claims to do. Or the chapter titles, really, it's very hard to write subtitles and titles and chapter titles, and and you write all this, and then if you can't find the pithy chapter title that encapsulates it, then you're like, either I have to write that chapter all over again, or I have to really work hard at coming up with a good chapter title. So I think this actually, so it's worthwhile reading it just so that you get a sense of its movement. So the first few sections are called the search for a historical tradition, which are mostly these historiographic questions, which are very sort of front-loaded, which is also nice. And then it's called the embedded traditions section, which is these fragments of quite detailed discussions from the Vedas, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana. The third section is called genealogies in the making of a historical tradition. So genealogies are a very, very important source. There are too many of them, and that's where at some level it's hard for a more contemporary reader to understand the investment. I mean, one can understand it, I suppose, that there's a fairly instrumental use of it, but they're a very large part of the tradition. So here there's a concentration on the, from sections of the Vishnu Purana. There's a long section on inscriptions, and again, if you remember the Prashastis and the pull of what we did. And then as the plays of Vishakadatta, so you have this interaction of the literary and the historical, which I will talk about more, but which I think Gayatri will also bring up. The fourth section is on alternative histories, as has been referred to. So monks as historians. I find this already fascinating. When you say monks as historians, for me it already sets up exactly why it's already interesting for me, and if you think about it, why would a monk be interested in this maybe secular, worldly, and partisan, as we will see, enterprise? Because I think one of the very interesting points that made is that history was really openly partisan in certainly the Buddhist times. So there is no attempt or desire or hope, maybe, for a kind of overall history. Or I want to open that question up in a strong way. Does history give up this claim to a kind of third-person stance, or objectivity, if you like? So what does it mean to say, yes, this is an openly partisan history? So here, of course, the sources that I use are monastic chronicles from Sri Lanka and Buddhist biographies. So we read in our class, we read the Buddha Charita in some detail, and we compared it to, as is evident and as is sort of foregrounded anyway, the Valmiki's Ramayana. And this is a large question. I'll just say it because not everyone's familiar with it, but a lot of the scholarship now is actually very engaged with this question of the Rama and Buddha being really contemporary and completely competing moralities happening in the same historical time period and in the same region. So you really think about it now, that these are two models, right? And you have a lot of investment in what is the good, what is the good, and you have these very competing kind of ideas of what is the relationship between, say, kingship and the renunciatory life. And that's why in a lot of Buddhism this never goes away, and there's a constant fascination with the figure of the king, and it is important that the Buddha renounced kingship. And of course they also like their Brahmins, I think, so Buddhism wasn't as we've known. There are lots of prominent Brahmins also. So, but I want to extrapolate from the monks as historians sort of question. I want to ask this question about how does this sort of Brahminical, if you like, and Kshatriya models really, why is it that, the persistent fascination with these twin figures and the idea that you choose and that you have to be one of these people, and to be one of these you have to renounce it. So there are lots of very direct sort of references where, the Gita telling Arjuna to fight in the battle is then, that same scene is sort of repeated in some of the Buddha stories with the exact opposite intention, which is you should renounce. And the true good life is renunciation, and not your sort of martial values, right? Not kingship, not the world. So, so a lot of work of Patrick Olivelle, for example. It's a very fat book by Hilton Beetle on Dharma. And the reason you don't see these fat Sanskrit books in the library is because I take them as soon as they arrive, and so you don't know they exist. But there are lots of very large and wonderful, it's a huge exploding field of scholarship, and I feel like saying even since my undergraduate days and even the 90s, when we did try to read ancient India, there didn't seem that much, but I feel like in the last 15, 20 years, the field has really exploded. And it's history, but also people writing from religious, locationally, if you like, religious studies departments, and of course in philosophy and all of these. There's actually a huge explosion, so it's actually a very, very thriving area of scholarship now, and lots of very interesting questions. And if one uses cultural questions in the good sense of the word culture, then I think it's actually expanded the field a lot, and there are lots of lots of very fascinating work. There's another very large book on the Kavya and turning points with Gary Tubb and Schumann and Bronner, and which is actually looking at history of literature in terms of these turning points and what it is. So it's not the old kind of history, which is just a listing, but actually one is able to relate it more to historical questions, but also more, strong aesthetic and philosophical questions, right? Okay. So the last section is called, to get back to the architecture, it's called Historical Tradition Externalized, and so it again goes back to a lot of the biographies. And I felt there's too much richness in this book to even try to do justice, but I'd like to maybe take off question of biography, because it's somewhere between, if you like, the history and the kavya and literature and all of that, right? So, sorry, you started me early, so how much time do I have? 15 minutes, okay. Okay. So now this is, and the last section is called, therefore, looking back and looking forward. So it's a nice way to end it. It actually then makes a certain point about, I think, I probably can't go into this, but perhaps in your comments about, okay, what is this investment again in the past? To show, and you referred to, I think, Arvind Sharma, for example, in one of the footnotes, and, I think that is a slightly more, one feels more unease with that strand, perhaps, which is trying to say, actually, we were, traditional all along, or, I think there's this anxiety to prove continuity. But I think Professor Raju also raised this question. And so I want to leave it open, this idea that actually there's a lot of continuity or conformity, which is I think the word Professor Thapar uses. And so how does one do it? One has to break out of this, there are lots of still reserves of continuity, conformity. And so that kind of project, which is not very different from some of the, say, the Pollock projects and a lot of the ideas that actually the discontinuity, wherever you locate it, whether it's in modernity or whatever you want to call it, enlightenment, industrialization, science, whatever. But the discontinuity is something to be not over-invested in, right? So how can one make a point for continuity without, on the one hand, falling for a kind of weird, helicopters in the Vedas kind of thing? But how does one take that question seriously also? Right? I think there's a large question, and that's one of the questions I will repeat the more formal questions I said, because the concept of the state, for example, is what I'd asked you about. Okay, so. And then the cleverness of the title, I thought the past before us is marvelous, because before in both the senses, and I think and that's a sort of insight you followed through the book, to be before. So then I'll get into some of the actual, the sort of the meat of the book, which is this question of again the Buddhist jhanas, because in some ways, so to this question we have that. We don't have, Indians always don't have it, right? We just never really had politics or political thought. We never really had science. We never really had philosophy. We never really had anything. So, and how does one answer that without, being nativist about it? So, I think the Buddhist Jaina moment is very important, because they seem to be much closer, maybe. So this is the contention to this modern genre of history, right? And Professor Thapar refers to the type of language used and the intention of the authors, right? So I'm just going to leave these open, these categories, but I think there's some things we can sort of work with. There's more concern with chronology, there's more concern with purpose, and since textures of time has been invoked before, and I invoke it again, not least because we've discussed it in class for a while. This question of history, and I think maybe it was Pollock who reviewed the book somewhere, and he said, well, what is this anxiety of proving there was some sort of history? A lot of the more post-structuralist people also said this. Why prove there's history? It could be just all text, right? So I think that's not a position you want to say. But for me, what's slightly more interesting than that is that he says there's no history doesn't function as a shastra, if I remember. So you have aesthetics, which is at least at some points became like a shastra. So you had what effectively it means is some sort of practice, like shipbuilding. You could have shipbuilding without engineering. So you could have history writing without sort of theory of history. So that kind of debate, which goes back again to a lot of the science debates, we had we didn't have these more general principles of the field. So when one looks at these Buddhist and Jaina chronicles, one would want to deal with the sort of question, right, about practice, embeddedness, all of that, right? And the investment in this question of history, of course, and it's interesting for me that at that point they still say, okay, we have history, and somehow to say its history is to make it more real, and that was also one of the questions. So you might think, and I think this question was also asked yesterday, about what if you had history or not? But we know that the fictionality of, say, the Hindu gods was a big deal in, say, the 19th century. Christ was better not because he had better ideas or he was nicer or anything, but because he was real. So this was really important. It's still important today. So, I mean, how does one really unpack this question, and does it mean that we then insist on a historicity? But if not, then how does one unpack this sort of claim, right? So we do not seem to be able to get out of this, right? So to go back to how was the Buddha exemplary, I'm wondering if this is a slightly different model of historicity in the world. So here he was, you tell me when there are 5 minutes left, right? Okay. So he was ethically exemplary. So this is one, the ethics. It foregrounds the ethical question. And B, there's a notion of a turning point. I don't want to say in history because then you're kind of back in the cycle. But there's some notion of a turning point, right? So then we see the evolution of these things. Like I said, it was always... I'm interested in this idea of history actually being openly sectarian. Why can we not make a claim to a kind of persuasion or argument without it needing to fall back into, a sort of total history, if you like, right? Okay. So a lot of history writing then is to rewrite the same story again. The more sectarian you get and the more there are quarrels, then people write more and more history because you're trying to prove. I would have liked to, this is where maybe the literature background or the more interest in the actual mechanics of the rhetoric, so to speak, would have been important to me, because how do you keep rewriting the story of, say, the miracles or the Enlightenment? Because these are the crucial points, right? This is what makes it not just somebody else's story, but the actual fact of the Enlightenment. Not our favorite Enlightenment, but the Buddha's Enlightenment. So how does, and every rewriting of it will, I would be actually interested in the textual maneuvers that, allowed this sort of, or give space for this kind of obsessive rewriting of it, right? Okay. So what is important in this sort of rewriting? You have the basic core story, and likewise you have the story of the institutionalization, which happens alongside, so the Sangha and all of the sects, and crucially also of the king. So we know Buddhism, I think in the Dharma sort of work, and again with Oliver and Hildebeetle and all that said, that Dharma starts being used in a new way. And very much, if I understood all these large books, they all read, Indology is now suddenly bursting with large books. If I understood the argument right, it suddenly takes this very political and even, if you like, imperialist connotation, Dharma post the Buddhist intervention. And so from being, I don't want to say private, but certainly the kind of universalistic morality is very much tied to imperial power, right? And I'm wondering what it means to own up to this. Buddhism is anyway seen as very urban sort of religion, anyway seen as, of the more sort of evolved, larger polities, as opposed to the what is believed sometimes some people as the Hindu ideal of the little kingdoms. The Mahabharata has these smaller sort of polities. And I'm wondering again how to think through this sort of politically as different political formations, which also not irrelevant to the current situation. How does one think of the smaller polity as opposed to always needing this kind of imperial India polity, right? Okay. So you have yet the little kingdoms, I'm not trying to say the little kingdoms are better, because then you had also a sort of Brahmanical consolidation, and then you had the Varna sort of system, and the state being made in Buddhism as a kind of ethical sort of category, and as well as enlarging the sort of notion of the state, right? So Buddhism, as we know, took a lot of ideas, but I'm interested again in the secularizing move, if you like, where you had all these sort of metaphysical ideas like karma. They had no trouble with that, or they used it a lot. But then how do you use those without it being quite divinized in the same way that it does in Hinduism? So you have a lot of the same metaphysical categories, and then you just bracket off all the floating, fighting gods, right? So I'm interested in this very people Hindu imagination, but where Buddhism could really use a lot of the terms, but without that divine overlay. And so what does it speak of that sort of interaction, right? To get into some of the further specifically Buddhist biographies, actually I'm fascinated again maybe more for literature background, just the genre. So there is something called the history of the future and genre, which is I really like to hear more about. But and it always struck me that the common utopias in all of these cultures wanted again, it's not maybe it was in the Adam and Eve sort of innocence rhetoric, but they just wanted to be lazy, I think, because all the utopias have ample leisure and no labor. So I'm wondering again how this, what does, because Shramanic actually comes from, as you said, from labor. So how does actual agency and labor and work and all of that really function within these sort of, epistemes? Okay, so, So I'm interested again. So biography, if biography individuates almost as a given, it is about a particular person. I mean, how does it then negotiate that individual type, representation, sort of all of those sort of categories, right? Because it is about the Buddha, but then at some point, of course, you have many Buddhas, and Buddha becomes a bird and an animal, and then he's still giving you gyan on the world. So am I actually interested in how these genres sort of travel, and this endless rewriting of the Enlightenment and of his death. I think these are apparently the two most. So I'm actually interested in that structure too, where these are the two things that's really worth talking about, really, your enlightenment and your death. So and because it's a quasi-divine figure, right? I mean, the Buddha. So then what does death mean, It's not at all, I think, like the death of Christ or the Christ on the cross. I think it's a very different understanding of what death means and why this has to be endlessly sort of rewritten, right? As you said, this sort of, you do the mirroring with the Rama figure, you can see this a lot about, the humanness of Buddha, the humanness of Rama, and not so much the Rama of the Ramayana, but since we've read all the Bhavaputi and all of that, it's so important to show the sort of human divine sort of figure, and I would have, I think you avoided comparing directly in terms of ideas, but if it's something worthwhile for you, I'd like to actually just put it on the table, and you can actually go through a series of. There are many Ramas and there are many Buddhas. So, but if you can construct a kind of column and then keep comparing it, I think that would tell you a lot about, the sort of the deeper world of these people and time. Okay, you said 5-6 minutes, right? Now 4. Yeah, so I would look at the structures more. I would have, for example, in a lot of the Buddhist texts, there's a structure is the adoration of Buddha by a past devotee with the former, then prophesying the rebirth of the devotee and the discovery of the Buddha. You won't understand it, and it's a little complicated. But what I mean is, actually, I'd like to learn more about the exact narratological structure, because for me, and I think this is what will maybe Gayatri will also raise, like the exact mode of literary argumentation is a little different, and I'd like to see how that kind of world is really constructed, right? All these pre-birth, post-birth, this adoration, this prophecy. We talked about different notions of time, but this idea of the prophecy is sort of somehow encircling the future is something I'd like to ask more about. So I'm down to you. You said 3 to whatever minutes. So I'll just jump to the questions. As happens with these questions, you a little bit lose interest after you write them, but you've taken pains to write on it, so I will rewrite. I won't reread it, but a little more conceptual maybe than I would have liked, really. So I'm kicking myself for it. But I think it's this question. One is I want to ask the question of the state, which is a sort of standard question, which is, you could say, it seems very descriptive at certain points in the early thing to say, for example, kingdom, not state. The word's used somewhat loosely, but we're a little bit stuck with the modern notion of the state, which we feel is post, Enlightenment, modernity, whatever you want to call it. That state is quite fundamentally different from anything that was conceivable in a pre-modern world. Maybe there's a circularity in this argument, but I'd like to hear what is this movement from, kingship or large kingships, imperials to the sort of state? Because if it's really a foundational concept, the state and the other, the masses, the state mass sort of dyad, then how does one really write about this in a pre-modern world? One can just have larger and larger aggregates of kings and kingships, but then you won't really have the state. Or if you do, then how does one, it's almost like a norm. So how does one sort of use that term, discriminately? The second question, I think, again, has been raised by many people, which is that a large part of the claims to historicity is subsets of these larger claims to realities. And I'm just wondering, since you gave me all those fascinating stories about the 60s Delhi University, but it just did seem like, you have a large resource in Indian philosophy, which is asking a lot of these questions about, the reality and logic and the nature of these propositions and what kind of evidence and how does one, the steps of inferential reasoning. And it just seems that was bracketed out of historiography for a long time. And I'm just wondering if there's any interest. I mean, in this book you do refer to Matilal and, but I'm just wondering, it's been largely absent, and I'm just also wondering if you could speculate on what the larger prognosis of the situation would be, because there is a very large body of work which is exactly interested, as all philosophical schools, on these questions of reality and, types of statements, types of claims. And there is a, sophisticated tradition and, in the Mimamsa and interpretation, aesthetics, all the Nyaya schools. So this is more like, how come this was just not there, and then what might be, how might it play out in the future? And the last question is maybe regional, and you can not address it because I don't quite know how to ask it. But again, I think the question about South India was brought up last time, but I'm interested in now, maybe more in the present. How does one imagine solidarities that are not geographic? Because that is such an obsession, all the way, as you referred, from Savarkar onwards, a sort of geographic integrity of a space. And how does one imagine the region, but not necessarily in a very easily, imagined way, like, region, like geography or language or caste, or, caste, for example, cuts across. So how does one use this word regional as a way of hacking away at these larger polities, but in a way that doesn't surrender too quickly to very preformed categories of, of caste and language and maybe even caste? So thank you again for the opportunity.
Perhaps I should begin by saying that the book originally was 1,200 pages. And it was my publisher who said, I don't think this will work, you better knock it down. And it broke my heart, because I then spent 3 months on reading page after page and sort of saying, should I really turn this out, or should I leave it in? Can't I just let it be? But anyway, I did finally bring it down, and I'm glad I did, because I think it would have been unreadable at that length. But there we are. The state, let me begin with the state. We all think that the state is post-Enlightenment, and therefore everything that came before had a certain uniform form, and therefore the state was not too important. The changes in the state were not so important. But let me begin by saying that the state, we must think of the state in terms of a category with many typologies. There isn't a single state. There are certain characteristics which we assume existed in what we call a state. But the balance of these characteristics always differed. And therefore, when one is talking about a state, when I talk about the state, I do insist that the Mauryan state was very different from the Gupta state. And we don't just talk about the state. We have to be much more categorical about the kind of state we mean. The state is a recognized community living under a particular form of government, and the form of government may change. And there are many theories from the past which are justifications of the emergence of government and its attendant state. One of my favorite examples is the difference in the Brahmanical and the Buddhist sources. In the Brahmanical sources, we're told that government and the state came about, or government certainly came about, with the battle going on between the Devas and the Asuras. And the gods were losing and were getting desperate and didn't know what to do, so they appealed to Prajapati, and Prajapati appointed Indra to lead them in war. And that meant victory for the Devas, and finally it meant establishing a system under the aegis of Indra, who then appointed Manu as the first ruler. It's very much based on dependence on deities and appointments from the deities. The Buddhist version, of course, is directly the opposite, that there was once a pristine utopia where everybody lived in complete harmony with each other. There was no problem at all. And then one fine day there was a gradual shift towards men proclaiming that certain women were theirs, and so the family came into existence. And once the family came into existence, it gradually led to battles over ownership of land and production of food to feed the families. And finally there was such terrible confusion that people came together and selected or elected one of their own, elected in fact, to govern them, to make laws by which they would all observe, the Mahasamatha. Now, there is a very great difference, and I can assure you that people like Rousseau and Engels had not read the Buddha, but the story is the same. So one rather suspects that this is a story from the Brahmanical side and a counter-story, much more in keeping with Buddhist thinking from the Buddhist side. But there is that there. The state then focuses on, initially the state consists of small polities, and it consists of oligarchies, not even democracies. Even the great Athenian democracy, for example, much touted and much spoken about in political theory. When you come down to the nitty-gritty, the city of Athens had 2/3 of its population was a slave population, and 1/3 was the free citizenry. And it was the 1/3 that ruled the city, and therefore this can hardly be called a democracy. But it is an oligarchy, and that is exactly what the Garna Sanghas were in the mid-first millennium in northern India. They were oligarchies, or to use the more fashionable anthropological term, they were chiefships. And it does make a lot of difference if you start reading the texts. If you remember that the word Raja, that is used both in the Vedic literature and in the Buddhist texts, simply means the one who is leading, the best person who is leading, nothing more. So it could be a chief. And I at least have argued in this book that I think that clan society with chiefships was really the initial society before it turned into kingships. And the meaning of Raja then changed from being the one who leads, who is the brightest, to the one who governs with divine sanction, as the Brahmanical sources would have it. We do have Kaudilya holding forth on this, and he's very clear in his definition of the change that takes place, change which is evident from the inscriptions that took place in the Mauryan period. And he defines the state as having a king, Swami, ministers and administration, a capital, a city from where government was carried out, a treasury, because by then there were taxes being collected, and once you have taxes being collected, you have to have an authority that collects them, an authority that keeps them and uses them as it chooses. And it uses them on coercion of various kinds, including the army, the armed forces, which is a very important aspect of coercion, protection of territory, and an ally. That is also a necessity in a state. This, according to Kautilya, is the definition of this change that has taken place from simple clan systems. He doesn't refer to them as clan system, but still, from a simple form of rule by a Raja, a centralized authority, to something much more diverse. When I say that the Mauryan state is different from the Gupta state, let me elaborate on this a little bit and argue that the Mauryan territory, being a very large territory, and we don't know whether the Mauryas actually controlled every bit of that territory. The boundaries are given according to wherever the Ashokan edicts are found, which is in itself a rather uncertain way of locating boundaries, but nevertheless, even if we assume that the edicts were all put up in places that were within the Mauryan Empire, then you have really a subcontinental empire to govern. And given the technology and the communications of that time, assuming that there were no aeroplanes and helicopters, it has been calculated that it would have taken the best part of 2 months, if not 3, for an order passed in Pataliputra, the capital, present-day Patna, to reach the big centers such as Gujarat, the places like Sannati, where edicts have been found, and the northwest of India particularly. Now, given all of that, and then various other factors that go into the discussion of administration, I at least have argued that the Mauryan administration really consisted of 3 levels of administration. One was the directly centralized administration, which probably covered a major part of the Ganges plain, which is the kind of area that Kautilya is dealing with in the Arthashastra. And then you have what I call core areas, the northwest, Gandhar, Gujarat, Orissa, where you have a kind of replica of the central administration, but functioning at a much more localized, decentralized level, so that some decisions would certainly be taken by these local authorities, not waiting for orders from the capital. And the third category is the much more vague category of what I call the peripheral administration, which is, for example, in the forested areas where the officers would go in, would collect the goods in kind that were supposed to be given as tax. And this is very clearly stated, that where there is agriculture and artisanal production, the taxes consist of the following categories, and various categories of taxes are given. And the amount to be collected is also mentioned in terms of coinage, as indeed salaries are mentioned in terms of coinage. Whereas in the peripheral administration, it's all, you go to the forest areas and you collect timber, and you collect honey, and you collect lac, you collect items, which the administration then brings to whichever center needs them. The Gupta period administration changes. It's a much smaller polity to begin with, and it's largely centralized administration, except in small pockets where you have these core areas and decentralized administration, but of a different kind. The post-Gupta period sees again a change, where the oligarchies or chiefships have been done away with, and so you don't have that administration. But you have kingdoms on a smaller scale as compared to the Gupta and the Maurya. And you have many new kingdoms coming up through a system of land grants. And then those of you who have looked at the historical debates will know that there was a very extensive debate amongst historians as to whether this can be called feudalism or not. Feudalism, of course, meaning feudalism of the European type, or of the Marxist type in the feudal mode of production. And on this there has been a very, very extensive debate, a very interesting debate, which has pushed a lot of the evidence for the reconstruction of history in this period in many directions and in the asking of many new questions. There is not complete agreement on the matter, as is the case with most interesting subjects. They are open still to question, and so there are some people that accept degrees of feudalism from a small degree to a very large degree, and there are others who reject it altogether. So the point that I'm trying to make really is to say that historically it is incorrect to say that there were no states prior to the Enlightenment period. What happens in the Enlightenment is that you get a different category of state. You get a state that gradually evolves towards democratic functioning, in which it is not a top-down functioning so much as a functioning where people are demanding representation in the systems of governance. That is a very major difference in the kind of state that comes in. Although it doesn't come in immediately and it doesn't come in overnight, it takes a long time to evolve. And then gradually, of course, from the late 18th century onwards, you also have the concept of the nation. So do remember that in the post-Enlightenment period, many historians make a distinction between the state and the nation-state. The nation-state is what we are talking about, and not the state as such, because the state as such consists of many kinds of states which existed in the earlier period. Yes, on this very interesting question of why do historians not read more philosophy? This is something that has struck me, and it struck me particularly when I was actually writing the book. Not so much when I was researching it and putting it together, but certainly when I was writing it. I was very struck by the fact, which is why I do make these little token references to Matilal and to Sundar and so on, because it did strike me that it is essential for somebody who's talking about the context in which these texts were written to know something more about the wider spread of what was happening in the philosophical scene at that time and what were the discussions. All I can say is my apologies for this lacune. If I had my life all over again, I think I would start off by studying philosophy and then come to history. But unfortunately, I don't have my life all over again, and the present one has a limited span. But I think there's another historiographical reason as well, which is that my generation, at least, grew up in understanding philosophy essentially as a totally unreal, idealistic way of thinking. And I think that this was partly the impact of nationalist philosophy. I mean, when you consider, if you take a book, I'm not being disrespectful to philosophers, but if you take a book like Radhakrishnan's History of Philosophy, and as a historian you start reading it, and this was the great book that was always quoted. I mean, this was the nationalist history of philosophy. This was any intellectual with any pretensions to being anything should quote from Radhakrishnan. And I do remember trying to books to read it, but I just found that I couldn't proceed. And so I think there was this feeling that, philosophy is unimportant because it's all idealistic. It's utterly unreal. People are just talking about abstractions all the time. And whereas we are talking about what we believed we knew, the reality. So this kind of dichotomy was very strong in those days, and that was, but this is not reason enough for having avoided doing something that we should certainly have done. I like to think, however, that there was a little, a slight borrowing of issues like the importance of logic and reasoning that came to us from the philosophical discourse. It came to us much more from the philosophical discourse of European philosophy than it did from Indian philosophy, for the simple reason that we really didn't take sufficient trouble to read Indian philosophy. But I would agree that it was, our hesitation grew out of the fact that it was a different time, a different society. There was, at that time, no nation state. We were moving towards a nation state, or we had just become a nation state. And there were lots of different identities, and we were bothered with trying to find a historical explanation to how we were to make these identities cohere. So that is my rather lame excuse for not having done what I should have done. Does history give up on claims to being non-partisan? No, I don't think so. I think written into all history is an understanding that one can't help but be somewhat partisan. The important thing today, for example, is it's always being said that historians have a bias, but the important thing is that that bias should be made evident. Not by starting a chapter by saying, I am a Marxist or I am a non-Marxist, but the way in which you argue, the way in which you reason, the kinds of evidence that you bring to the discussion, the kinds of generalization you make, should make it clear somewhat where your partisanship lies. And this is something that, one is very well aware of. The interesting dichotomy that you suggested between Rama and Buddha is something that is interestingly being worked on these days, both by a few historians and more by historians of religion, where it's being argued. The question has been asked, and I must say that after recently having reread the Bhagavad Gita, the question has been asked, how much of the Gita is actually not a response to the Shramanic tradition? And as you read it, if you keep that question in mind, as you read the text, you begin to say, my goodness, he is trying to answer those questions. It is very much a response. As far as the Buddha Charita goes, the Ashvaghosha confesses to being deeply influenced by the Ramayana. And he's writing his text on the basis of the Ramayana. But also remember that a religion that is propagating itself through kind of conversions, not exactly a conversion, but a kind of conversion, does need the biographies of its founders and its major characters. And therefore it's not surprising that the Buddha biography was being constantly written and rewritten time and again, because it was a very important text in the process of propagation. The question that I've often thought about recently is not so much the Brahman Kshatriya ideal in the opposition of Ram and Buddha, because remember that the Kshatriya ideal at that stage was not so much the ideal of violence and warriorship, it was land ownership. The Kshatriyas were the owners, they were members of the clans that owned the land. And this puts a slightly different emphasis on the kinds of roles that the Kshatriyas played. I mean, the famous quotation from the Shatapad Brahman where it talks about the Kshatriya eats the Vaishya, eats the Vish, the clan, in the same way as the deer eats grain. This is not a violent eating. This is a kind of grabbing, absorbing, laying claim to that. But I've often wondered whether, in fact, the dichotomy is not better expressed in Krishna and Buddha rather than Ram and Buddha, given the fact that Krishna, especially in the Mahabharata, the Krishna of the Mahabharata, is not someone who conforms to the rules and regulations of moral behavior very closely, in as much as the propagation of violence in itself is, from the Buddhist point of view, an unethical position. So I think that is the kind of work that is being done now on this very interesting period of after the Buddha and after the Mahabharata, what is going on, why are bits and pieces being added onto the Mahabharata, like the whole of the Shanti Parvan and the Anushasan Parvan. Isn't this a discourse that's going on with the Shramanic tradition? And I think that this is certainly a question worth considering. Sorry?
You could say a few words about Professor Devika's. Or did you just
I
together?
did that.
I'm sorry.
I did that. Yes,
Sorry.
I did that. Yes, no, I did that. I think, was that all, or was there anything else? The question of region, of course, is very interesting, but do remember that when we say caste was universal across the subcontinent, it was treated very differently according to the regions. I mean, the way in which castes, whether Hindu castes or castes in Islam or Christianity or whatever it is, the regional impact, the regional culture, the regional geography, the regional history was very strongly felt in the way in which caste was articulated. The Brahman of Kashmir is very different from the Brahman of Tamil Nadu. And certainly the attitudes to the middle castes between the two extremes are very, very different from region to region. So I think that the question of region is something which we haven't addressed fully, neither historically nor in contemporary terms. But it is an important question to keep in mind.